Talk to me. Talk to me.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Gersten, host of Chatting with History, where you can listen in to conversations I have with some of the most famous characters in the history of Western civilization. And today's guest is no exception. It's Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. A consummate politician, he held offices at the city, state, and federal levels, and his achievements as a naturalist, explorer, hunter, author, and a soldier are as much a part of his fame as any office he ever held. So, without further delay, let's meet Theodore Roosevelt. Mr. President, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan, and please call me Colonel. I really can't stand being called Theodore, and Theo sounds too, affected, and I'm not the affected kind.
Colonel? What about Teddy?
Can't stand it. It's vulgar. It's an outrageous impudence. And as a child, I was called Teddy, and I got nauseous just thinking about it. So, please, call me Colonel. Political friends and others who work closely with me customarily address me by that rank.
Okay, Colonel it is. So why don't we begin by you telling us of your childhood?
Well, I was born on October 27th, 1858, in a four-story brownstone at 28 East 20th Street, in what is now Gramercy Park section of New York City. I was the second of four children born to Theodore Roosevelt, Sr., and Martha Bullock, who was called Mitty.
And, I understand your family had a presence in the New York City area for, a pretty long time.
Well, that's true. My ancestry is what I describe as half Irish and half Dutch, and ancestors on the Roosevelt side of the family were Dutch colonists living in New Amsterdam since the mid-1600s.
And, your family did pretty well there.
Oh, in that regard, I guess I was pretty fortunate. My father was a philanthropist, merchant, and partner in the family's glass importing business, Roosevelt and Son.
So, what were the politics of the Roosevelts?
Well, the family was strongly Democratic until the mid-1850s when we joined the new Republican Party. Father was a devout Unionist and a prominent supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the Union effort during the Civil War.
Yeah, but that wasn't the case with your mother. I bet that led to some spirited conversations around the dinner table.
Oh, yes. Mother was a Southern belle from a slave-owning family in Georgia, and she maintained Confederate sympathies. Plus, two of her brothers were both in the Confederate Navy. Even so, I always knew that the Union would prevail.
Really? How so?
Because I often heard sounds coming from my parents' bedroom that sounded like a battle with grunts and groans and all sorts of noises. And when it really got loud, I could hear my mother yell, "I surrender!"
Yes, bedroom battles. Still, it was your dad who was your hero.
Oh, absolutely. He was the best man I ever knew. He combined the strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness. He would not tolerate in us children selfishness or cruelty, idleness, cowardice, or untruthfulness. Shame, really, as there seems to be a lack of people with his character these days, especially among parents and in politicians claiming to serve the people.
So, back to your childhood. I understand you were a sickly kid.
Yes, I was an asthmatic and had to sleep propped up in bed or slouching in a chair for most of my early years. And it seemed I was always suffering from some ailment or another. A bit later, Father encouraged me to begin exercising, and I took up boxing to help improve my poor physical condition.
Okay. Why don't you tell us about your education?
Well, I was mostly schooled at home by tutors and by my parents, which enabled me to be learned in geography, history, and biology, as well as in French and German. However, I was deficient in math, Latin, and Greek.
Still, you must have learned something, because you matriculated at Harvard College in 1876. That is, of course, assuming that you didn't buy your way in or use the family influence like so many well-connected families appear to have done.
Oh no, I earned my way into Harvard, and when Father died in 1878, I redoubled my activities there, doing well in science, philosophy, and rhetoric, and of course biology, having already been recognized as an accomplished naturalist and a published ornithologist.
Plus, you were active outside of the classroom as well.
Oh, most definitely. I belonged to the Alpha Delta Phi Literary Society, and I was a Deke, a member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity. I also edited a student magazine and was active in rowing and boxing. Why, I was the runner-up in the Harvard Boxing Championship when I was there.
You know, I've heard you had quite the memory and could multitask. I mean, long before multitasking became the rage that it is today.
Oh yes, what I lacked in physicality as a child was more than made up for with my mental gifts that I had received. I had what some would say a photographic memory, and I devoured books on many subjects, memorizing every detail. Plus, I could dictate letters to one secretary, memorandum to another, all while browsing through a book.
You know, forgive me, Colonel, but I have to ask. Were you a snob?
Why? Because I was a member of Harvard's Purcellian Club? Or because I sought out the company of the smartest people? Utter hogwash! The motto of the Purcellian Club is, "While we live, let us live," and I heartily endorse that. Why not? And if that means surrounding yourself with smart, learned, and engaging people in witty conversation, especially over a great meal, so be it.
Well, okay then. So you graduated Harvard Phi Beta Kappa with an AB magna cum laude in 1880.
Yes, I thought I'd become an attorney and entered Columbia Law School.
Yeah, but you dropped out.
Oh, yes, I was more interested in politics than law, and when I was offered the chance to run for the New York State Assembly in 1881, I grabbed it and bid law school goodbye.
You know, before we get into your early political career, I'd like to learn about your private life. You married Alice Hathaway in 1880, and about 4 years later, she died of an undiagnosed case of kidney failure. Shortly after giving birth to your daughter, who was also named Alice. Compounding this tragedy, your mother died of typhoid fever on the very same day as your wife.
I don't want to talk about it. Let's move on.
Well, surely this must have been quite a traumatic event, no?
I don't want to talk about it. Let's move on.
Okay, fair enough. So, moving on, I've heard you were quite the Republican activist when in the New York State Assembly.
That's true. Supposedly, I wrote more bills than any other state legislature.
And that got you noticed nationally.
Guess so. In 1884, I attended the Republican National Convention and aligned myself with the Mugwumps, a group of reformers within the Republican Party. We basically tried to get a person other than Senator James G. Blaine of Maine nominated to be our candidate for president, but lost out to what was referred to as the stalwart faction.
And what was that about?
It was a battle within the Republican Party over civil service and patronage. The stalwarts were more traditional, Republicans who favored machine politics and a spoils system, rewarding supporters by appointing them to key administrative positions in government, even if they were unqualified for it. The half-breeds, as they were called then, were the predecessors of the Mugwumps and represented moderate Republicans seeking civil service reform and appointments based on merit. Why, they were instrumental in writing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. However, despite its passage, its implementation was slow and political affiliation continued to be the basis for appointments to many political positions.
Hell, it's still going on today. I can recall President George W. Bush appointing a buddy of his to be the head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Some guy named Michael D. Brown. Problem was, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, Brownie was nowhere to be found.
Yes, I noticed that. Plus, it's now happening with the court system, where judges are appointed based on party affiliation and not on whether they know the law or the Constitution, or can put aside their politics.
Anyhow, back to the Mugwumps.
Yes, well, James G. Blaine, the GOP nominee, was financially corrupt and plagued by scandals, especially when it came to patronage, and the Mugwumps attempted to block his nomination.
Wow. That Republican National Convention of 1884 must have really been something.
Oh, I'll say. It ended with Blaine's nomination and with most of the Mugwumps bolting from the Republican Party to support Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate for president.
And what did you do? Did you bolt to support Cleveland?
I was really troubled by the turn of events and gave serious thought to bolting. But that's not how I was raised. I was raised to be loyal. And while I couldn't support Blaine, I didn't openly criticize nor support Cleveland. In fact, I was so disillusioned by party politics that I retired to a ranch I had purchased in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory.
Yes, I've heard you were quite the cowboy.
Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far. Even so, I built a second ranch north of the then boomtown of Medora, North Dakota, and I learned to ride Western style, rope and hunt. And I began to write about the frontier life for Eastern magazines, as well as publishing 3 books.
And you were a lawman.
Yes, I was a deputy sheriff and got some notoriety when I hunted down 3 outlaws, captured them, and brought them back to be tried.
A regular Wyatt Earp. Anyhow, you didn't stay out west, did you?
Nope. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was downright awful. My herd of cattle and those of my competitors were wiped out, along with $60,000 I had invested in ranching. Today, that would be about $1 million. So, I headed back to New York, made Sagamore Hill and Oyster Bay, a house I had built on Long Island in 1885, my official home. Why, I even ran as the GOP candidate for mayor of New York. I guess it wasn't to be, as I finished 3rd.
And you once again married.
Yes, after I lost the election, I needed some time to get away, and I headed to London. Married my childhood sweetheart there, Edith Caro, and we honeymooned in Europe. While there, I led a group to the summit of Mont Blanc, an accomplishment for which I was included into the British Royal Society. Anyhow, Edith and I remained together until my death, and together we had 6 children.
And in 1888, you re-entered politics.
Yes, I did. Campaigned in the Midwest for Benjamin Harrison, who was elected our 23rd president, and once in office, he appointed me to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, where I stayed for about 7 years, until 1895.
Well, wait a second. I thought you were against the spoils of politics. Wasn't being appointed by Harrison? He's paying you back for working on his campaign?
Yes, I was, and I'm still against it. Plus, I was qualified for that appointment, and during my years at the Civil Service Commission, I vigorously fought the spoils system and demanded enforcement of civil service laws. In fact, my performance there earned me the respect of Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. And when he was elected to succeed Harrison, he reappointed me to the same post I had with Harrison, a Republican.
And in 1895, you left the Civil Service Commission.
Yes, I did. Had the opportunity to become president of the Board of New York City Police Commissioners. And in my 2 years there, I radically reformed the police department, reputed to be the most corrupt in America. Among my accomplishments were establishing new disciplinary rules, creating a bicycle squad to enforce traffic laws, and a standardization for the use of pistols by my officers. I also implemented regular inspections of firearms and annual physical exams. And I appointed 1,600 recruits based on their physical and mental qualifications and not on political affiliation. Why, I even had telephones installed in station houses.
So, for how long were you a police commissioner?
About 2 years. I left in 1897 when I was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley, a Republican.
Well, that must have been a fun job. You had always been fascinated by naval history.
Oh, that is true. While at Harvard, I began a systematic study of our role our fledgling Navy played in the War of 1812, and after graduation, my book, The Naval War of 1812, was published and greeted with much acclaim. And now, largely thanks to the inactivity of the Secretary of the Navy, I basically ran the department. In fact, 10 days after the battleship Maine exploded on February 15, 1898, in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, I made myself acting secretary when the real secretary left for a massage. During those 4 hours, I told the Navy worldwide to prepare for war, ordered ammunition and supplies, brought in experts, and went to Congress asking for authority to recruit sailors.
Yeah, it sure sounds like you were instrumental in preparing the Navy for what would turn out to be the Spanish-American War. But you didn't stay long with the department.
Hell no. Once the war was officially declared in 1898, I resigned from the Navy Department, and with the aid of an Army colonel named Leonard Wood, who, by the way, has a fort named after him, created the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which was comprised of a diverse group that included cowboys and Ivy Leaguers.
The Rough Riders.
Ah, yes, that was what the newspapers called us. Originally, I was a lieutenant colonel serving under Colonel Wood, but when he took charge of the brigade and was promoted to brigadier general, I was given the regiment and the rank of colonel.
Though now a colonel, you weren't one of those behind the front offices now, were you?
Who, me? No way, Jose. Had to be right up there leading my men. Plus, I was the only one with a horse, as we had to leave the other horses behind because of the lack of transport ships. Imagine cavalry without horses. Still, on July 1st, 1898, in Cuba, I led my men in a dual charges up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. A month later, the fighting in Cuba was basically over, and I and the other officers demanded we be returned home.
What then?
I returned to civilian life, which was relatively short-lived because in November of 1898, I was elected governor of New York, and in that capacity went after corruption and machine politics as I had in my earlier positions. Evidently, I angered the New York Republican boss so much that he forced President McKinley, running for re-election in 1900, to take me as his running mate.
Yeah, and when McKinley won, you became our nation's vice president.
Yes, but it was pretty uneventful. About the only thing of note during my tenure as VP was giving a speech in which I mentioned, "Speak softly and carry a big stick."
And what in the world does that mean?
It's a form of diplomacy. Negotiate peacefully while simultaneously suggesting the use of force should it be necessary.
Yeah, well, I guess it's effective. You know, though there were times not so long ago that we didn't talk so softly and we went pretty quickly to the big stick. Anyhow, you know, your time as vice president was short-lived.
Yes, quite a surprise and shock, I must say. On September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot while at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. And while the initial report suggested his condition was improving, he died 8 days later on the 14th. That afternoon, I was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States of America, and at the age of 43 years, I became the youngest man ever to hold that office.
And how was that? I mean, one day being our nation's vice president, and the next, it's president.
Well, any surprise quickly passed, and like I do with many things I take on, I jumped right in and got to work. I kept McKinley's cabinet and promised to continue his policies.
So what were some of your priorities?
Well, I held the view that the president was a steward of the people, and that, as president, I should take whatever action I felt was necessary for the public good. And while I did not usurp power, I did greatly broaden the use of executive power.
And what were some of your major accomplishments, you know, from a domestic perspective?
My domestic program, which many refer to as the Square Deal, was formed upon three basic ideas: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. It was aimed at helping middle-class citizens and involved attacking wealthy and powerful individuals and large corporations, while at the same time protecting business from what I considered extreme demands on the part of organized labor.
Wow, helping the middle class by attacking wealthy and powerful individuals and large corporations. I mean, where have I heard that situation before?
Yes, I'm a firm believer that the health and prosperity of America is fundamentally tied to the health and prosperity of its middle class, and that there are elements of our society, individuals and the large corporations they run, who seem to care about enriching themselves and milking the country.
Well, I mean, 100 years after your presidency, we're still faced with the same predicament. And it would seem that the Republican Party, your party, no longer cares about the middle class and cares more about enriching themselves and the wealthy individuals and corporations that fund their campaigns and enable their lifestyle.
Yes, that makes me both sad and angry. As a Republican, I can say I've seen America's enemy, and it is us.
Anyhow, you know, what were some specific accomplishments of your Square Deal?
Well, let's see. There were just so many of them. One of my first notable acts was to go before Congress and demand that it curb the power of large corporations, which we called trusts.
Yes. What was that about?
Well, one instance involved large corporations forcing, or extorting, railroads to give them rebates. On the surface, this may not seem like a bad thing, but if you were a small farmer in the Midwest, it was grossly unfair, as you weren't allowed equal access to the services of the railroad and had to pay higher rates.
So what did you do?
Under my leadership, Congress passed the Elkins Act in 1903, which forbid railroads from giving rebates and stated rates had to be published.
Yeah, but this law really didn't go far enough, did it?
No, not really. While the measure brought some improvement, other abuses still needed to be addressed. So in 1906, the Hepburn Act was passed, which strengthened existing railroad regulations and basically gave the Interstate Commerce Commission more power and oversight.
What were some other measures you adopted as a trust buster?
Well, in 1903, I persuaded Congress to establish a new cabinet-level department, the Department of Commerce and Labor. This was done despite the lobbying of big business interests against it. And within this new department, the Bureau of Corporations was established to find violations under existing antitrust legislation. It began with investigations into the activities of meatpacking, oil, steel, tobacco industries, among others. In all, 44 suits were brought during my administration.
But the square deal wasn't just about going after the abuses of corporations. I mean, was it?
Oh no, there were times the demands of organized labor were deemed to be extreme and not in the best interest of America.
Was the anthracite strike of 1902 one of those times?
Not really. The strike, which took place in the spring of 1902 in eastern Pennsylvania, was an effort by the United Mine Workers to get higher wages, shorter hours, safer working conditions, and recognition for their union, demands which the mine owners and operators rejected.
And how did the public react to this strike?
They largely sided with the workers, even when the strike dragged on through the summer and into the fall, and a number of businesses and schools had to close for lack of coal for heating. Public sentiment for the workers increased when a letter from the coal operators' leader chastised the strikers for not trusting Christian men like himself, whom, he went on, God had given control over the nation's property interests.
Again, over 100 years later, the United States is still dealing with hypocritical Christian men feeling that they're God's gift to America. And that we should trust them simply because of that. Anyhow, back to the strike. I mean, when did you get involved?
I really had no authority in the matter. Still, I summoned representatives from both sides to the White House and proposed arbitration, which the miners accepted, but the owners declined.
Yeah, I bet that pissed you off.
Not my choice of words, but you could say that. So I threatened to send in federal troops to take over the mines, and after further negotiations, a settlement was reached and the strike ended in March of 1903, resulting in a large wage increase, but no union recognition.
Wow, okay. Threatening to send in troops? I mean, is this another example of speaking softly and carrying a big stick?
Well, what do you think?
Okay, moving on. So during your watch, we also had the Federal Employers' Liability Act passed to protect labor, or more specifically, railroad workers.
Yes, there were a high number of railroad deaths in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as injuries, and many workers and their families were not covered for loss. This act was passed in 1906, found unconstitutional, and then repassed in 1908. FELA, as the act is referred to, allows monetary payouts for pain and suffering as decided by a jury.
I guess that made litigation lawyers happy.
Ah, yes. An unfortunate and unseen consequence. Kind of makes me want to go shark hunting.
Anyhow, moving on. I mean, what were some of your accomplishments related to consumer protection?
To begin with, our nation's food supplies and companies in the patent medicine businesses were ripping off Americans while poisoning them. In 1906, we passed the Meat Inspection Act, which brought reforms of the processing of cattle, sheep, horses, swine, and goats destined for human consumption, including that all animals were required to pass an inspection by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration prior to slaughter. It also set cleanliness standards for slaughterhouses and processing plants. This act was followed by the very first Pure Food and Drug Act, which was applied to goods shipped in foreign or interstate commerce. Its purpose was to protect the public against adulteration or misbranding of food and from products identified as helpful without scientific support. Specifics included the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, which was entrusted with the responsibility of testing all foods and drugs destined for human consumption. Also, the law required there be prescriptions from licensed physicians before a patient could purchase certain drugs, as well as label warnings on habit-forming drugs.
So, I mean, we have you to thank for these crucial consumer protection laws.
In some way, but still, the beef industry fought against passage of the Meat Inspection Act, and in that same industry, as well as other food producers and medicine makers, had a well-funded and vocal lobbying association. What it comes down to is this. In addition to me, you have to thank the congressmen of the time who cared more about the health and safety of Americans rather than the health and well-being of the food industry or their bank accounts. And I dare say many were Republicans.
Yes, I mean, quite a comparison between Republicans of your day and the Republican Party of today when it comes to putting the welfare of Americans above wealthy and powerful individuals and corporations.
Yes, I've been watching with a mixture of shock and disappointment.
So, I mean, why don't we talk about something of which I believe you're especially proud, your record as a conservationist, and the third basic idea behind your square deal. And I must say, I mean, it's quite impressive.
Why, thank you. During the time I was president, from 1901 to 1909, I designated 150 national forests, the first 51 federal bird reservations, 5 national parks, the first 18 national monuments, the first 4 national game preserves, and the first 21 reclamation projects. Altogether, I provided federal protection for almost 230 million acres, a land area equivalent to all of the East Coast states from Maine to Florida. In addition, and while this really has little, if anything, to do with conservation, in 1907, I signed a proclamation establishing Oklahoma as the 46th state of the Union.
And at the time, you appointed a record number of judges.
Yes, I did. 75 federal judges to be exact, including 3 justices to the Supreme Court: Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., William Rufus Day, and William Henry Moody.
Still, with all this progress, with all this reform, your administration was not without economic difficulties.
Oh, this is true. In the summer of 1907, the American economy was showing signs of weakness as a number of businesses and Wall Street brokerages went bankrupt. In October, the respected Knickerbocker Trust in New York City and the Westinghouse Electric Company both failed, shutting off a series of events known as the Panic of 1907. Businesses collapsed, stock market prices plummeted, and depositors made a massive run on the nation's banks.
And what did the federal government do?
The U.S. Treasury pumped millions of dollars into weak banks in the hopes of saving them, but the string of collapsed institutions lengthened. Fortunately, J.P. Morgan, a leading financier of the time and a great American, stepped in. He summoned the leading bankers and financial experts to his home, and over the course of the next 3 weeks, a joint effort of the government and these business leaders markedly improved conditions.
So what happened afterwards?
Once the crisis passed, the finger-pointing began. Reform elements of both political parties believed the American banking system was fundamentally flawed and needed wholesale change. Business leaders, however, held that my progressive legislation had upset the natural order of the economy and the government should stop its meddling. Meddling. Feh! Gradually, we reformers gained the upper hand, and an emerging consensus affirmed that a thorough bank reform was necessary to provide badly needed currency elasticity and the general soundness of the banking system.
Again, over 100 years later, we're still in need of reforming the financial system.
Yes, I've been watching, and just as in 1907, when quasi-investment firms we called bucket shops scammed and bilked investors, you still have banks and brokerage firms and so-called financial advisors, like that Bernie Madoff crook, more interested in lining their own pockets than in enriching or safeguarding their clients' portfolios.
Anyhow, what did Congress do?
In 1908, it passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which provided short-term aid to ease the ongoing credit crunch. The legislation allowed national banks to issue notes on a wider range of securities than previously allowed. The overall effect of that policy was to put more money in circulation.
Well, I'd now like to switch gears and talk about your foreign policy achievements. As you think back over this aspect of your presidency, what comes to mind?
Well, I like to believe that I led the U.S. into the arena of international power politics, thrusting aside American tradition of isolationism. I successfully applied the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, keeping Europe out of Latin America. I mediated international disputes over Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Morocco. I was the first world leader to submit a dispute to the Court of Arbitration at The Hague, and I was also the first head of state to call for convening the Second Hague Peace Conference, at which I obtained for Latin American nations equal status with the rest of the world, winning the adoption of the Drago Doctrine, which outlawed the use of force in the collection of foreign debts.
And, it was during your administration that the Panama Canal was started.
Oh, yes. Up until then, the only practical way for Americans to travel between the East and West coasts by ship was to sail around the southern tip of South America, and, more importantly, our Navy had no quick way to get its ships from one ocean to the other. So we started thinking about digging a canal across the narrow Panamanian Isthmus in Central America, which was then part of Colombia. We began negotiations with Colombia, and on January 22, 1903, the Hay-Harran Treaty was signed, which stated that in exchange for an upfront payment of $10 million and 9 annual payments of $250,000, Colombia would agree to lease a strip of land across Panama to the United States for the new canal.
Yeah, and so now, we could build the Panama Canal.
Not exactly. For a number of reasons, the Colombian Congress slow-walked ratifying the treaty. maybe hoping to get a better deal, and the Hay-Herran Treaty was never ratified. So we gave up dealing with the Colombians and looked for another way to get the land we needed to build a canal linking the two oceans.
Well, I mean, we know there is a Panama Canal, and that the U.S. was instrumental in it being built and in running it up until 1999. So, I mean, how did it happen?
Well, fortunately, there were some Panamanian rebels. Yes, I believe that's what they were. Panamanian rebels. And they wanted their independence from Colombia. And let's just say the United States helped them. And when they declared their independence, we quickly recognized the new country. And before you could say Panamanian independence, we had a treaty granting us rights to build and definitely administer the Panamanian Canal Zone and its defenses. In 1904, construction began on the canal, which was completed 10 years later in 1914.
Yeah, I mean, pretty efficient, I must say, and a little suspicious.
Oh, I don't know. We just did what needed to be done.
Fair enough. I mean, so, what were some other foreign policy accomplishments, during your administration?
Well, the first great war of the 20th century, the Russo-Japanese War, was going on between Russia and the Japanese empires over Manchuria and Korea. It started in 1904, and by 1905, after defeats by Japan and experiencing economic hardship at home, Russia had had enough. So I offered to mediate, and on September 5th, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed, ending the conflict.
And for your efforts, you won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, it was quite an honor.
Together with the fact that you also earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for your efforts in the Spanish-American War, being the only president to do so, you're the only person in history to receive both his nation's highest honor for military valor and the world's, foremost prize for peace.
Yes, but I didn't receive the Congressional Medal of Honor until 2001. Still, who's counting?
On an issue related to the Russo-Japanese War, was the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. What can you tell us about that?
It had to do with Japanese immigration and the segregation of Japanese school children in San Francisco. Prior to the earthquake of 1906, Japanese immigrants went to schools throughout the city. Afterwards, though, the earthquake was used as an excuse to segregate Japanese school children in schools, offering an education inferior what they had been receiving. Japanese families here complained and contacted the media in Japan, causing a potential international incident.
And what did you do?
I wanted to do three things. One, show Japan that the policies of California did not reflect the ideals of the entire country. Second, force San Francisco to end its segregation policies. And third, find a resolution to what some considered the Japanese immigration problem. After much resistance from San Francisco, a compromise was reached on February 15, 1907. The Japanese government agreed to stop issuing passports to laborers seeking to enter the U.S., and the United States agreed to accept the presence of Japanese immigrants already residing in America, to permit the immigration of wives, children, and parents, and to avoid legal discrimination against Japanese children in California schools.
Seems we might be in the need for some gentlemen's agreements today. Given how the issue of immigration has become a major national issue. Anyhow, you mentioned the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. What can you tell us about that?
On April 18, 1906, at a little after 5 in the morning, the city of San Francisco and much of the surrounding Bay Area was wrecked by a great earthquake, which was followed by a number of destructive fires.
And what role, if any, did the federal government have in this disaster?
By 7 that morning, troops under the command of General Frederick Funson from Fort Mason began to arrive, providing order and assisting however they could, and throughout the day. More and more federal troops came. On the 19th, the Secretary of War, Taft, ordered that 200,000 rations and all tents in the U.S. Army be sent to San Francisco. In addition, the USS Chicago arrived in San Francisco Bay and aided in the rescue of 20,000 civilians on the 20th, the same day that Lieutenant Colonel Turney of the Medical Department became in charge of the sanitation in San Francisco.
So, what financial assistance did the federal government provide?
Congress and I appropriated $2.5 million for emergency relief, a figure that I believe translates to more than $50 million today.
I heard that a number of foreign governments, including China, offered to send donations and that you turned them all down. Why?
I felt that America needed to show the world that we can take care of our own and can provide all the relief necessary. Still, I thanked all governments and nations for their offers of aid.
Well, it sounds like you're being a bit arrogant and didn't want to be beholden to any country.
Whatever. The reality is that we built a new San Francisco, bigger and better than before.
So, back to foreign policy. There's one more thing I want to touch upon, and that's the Great White Fleet.
Well, you know that I'm a Navy man and a firm believer in the power of a strong Navy in protecting our interests, holdings, and citizens around the world, as well as enforce our treaties. Anyhow, with the help of Congress, we transformed our Navy of just 90 small ships, and with over a third of them wooden, into a modern fleet made of steel. And to demonstrate our military presence and power and naval capacity, I sent 2 squadrons containing a total of 16 battleships, along with various escorts, on an around-the-world tour that lasted 2 years from about 1907 to 1909. And as the hulls of the ships were painted white, the fleet was given the nickname of the Great White Fleet.
In 1908, you could have run for re-election and chose not to. Why?
I was tired, and given that I became president shortly into McKinley's term, it was as if I had been elected president for 2 terms already. Plus, I felt that William Howard Taft, my Secretary of War, would continue with my policies and keep America on the path I helped put us on.
So what'd you do after leaving office?
I went on safari, of course, in East and Central Africa. It was financed by Andrew Carnegie and by the promise of my writing about it. We hunted for specimens for the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where I believe Robin Williams played me in the movie Night at the Museum. All in all, we killed or trapped about over 11,000 animals, including 512 big game animals.
While you were on safari, did you stay in touch with American politics?
Yes, I did, though I tried not to. Kept hearing things about Taft this and Taft that, and what I was hearing troubled me.
Like what?
He just did a number of things wrong and alienated many of the different constituencies within the Republican Party. He oversaw the passage of a tariff that should never have been passed, and he placed too much reliance on the courts to decide issues of fairness rather than take the lead. The bottom line was that the left wing of the Republican Party, yes, we had one back then, began agitating against Taft. And Senator Robert Lafayette of Wisconsin created the National Progressive Republican League to defeat the power of political bossism at the state level and to replace Taft at the national level.
So, were you considering changing your mind and running for president?
Not at first. Despite my doubting Taft's leadership abilities, I remained friendly toward him and favored his re-election in 1912. All of this came to an end when Taft went after U.S. Steel, which I felt was a good trust, and I came to believe that only I could save the Republican Party from defeat in the upcoming presidential election.
So what'd you do?
Well, I announced my candidacy for the nomination, of course. However, I delayed too long in doing so, and Taft had already locked up the support of most of the party's leaders. And despite winning 9 of the 12 states that held Republican primaries, I was unable to overcome the support that Taft had in states without primaries.
Primaries?
Oh yes, primaries. The 1912 primaries represented the first extensive use of the presidential primary, a reform achievement of the progressive movement. And while they demonstrated my popularity with the electorate, they weren't nearly as pivotal back then as they are today.
Yeah, tell me about it. The campaign to be the Republican candidate for president in 2012, with all the debates and primaries and caucuses was quite an event.
Event? More like a circus or a circus sideshow with all the clowns aspiring to hold the highest office in the land. My office. Made me both sad and angry that my Republican Party had deteriorated so much and that the quality of those seeking the presidency was so poor.
Anyhow, back to 1912.
After 2 weeks at the Republican convention in Chicago, I realized that I would not win the nomination outright. And so my followers and I left the convention hall and moved to the Auditorium Theater, where key allies and myself created the Progressive Party. I ran as that party's candidate for president, calling for a vigorous government intervention to protect the people from selfish interests.
And, while campaigning, you were the victim of an attempted assassination.
That's true. Was in Milwaukee on October 14th, 1912, and was shot in the chest. Fortunately, the bullet was slowed by a steel eyeglass case and a 50-page speech I was carrying in my pocket. The bullet lodged in my chest, and realizing I wasn't gravely wounded, I gave my speech, which lasted about 90 minutes.
And, I mean, that's how the Progressive Party also became known as the Bull Moose Party. I mean, when you proclaim to the crowd that you've been shot and that it would take more than that to kill a bull moose.
Yes. Afterwards, it was determined that attempting to remove the bullet would be more dangerous than leaving it where it was, and so I carried it with me for the rest of my life.
You know, probably a good thing they didn't have metal detectors in those days. Then again, they didn't really have airports either. Anyhow, you lost the election.
Yes, came in second behind Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, who won 42% of the vote. I won 27% of the vote, more than Taft, the incumbent president, and I carried Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, South Dakota, Washington, and California. Didn't win a single southern state, though.
Yeah, kind of amazing how things change over time. I mean, here it is 100 years later, and the southern states are Republican strongholds.
Yes, but then the Republican Party of today bears little resemblance to the grand old party I knew and loved.
So, now that the election is over and a Democrat is president, what'd you do?
I headed to South America and explored. Why, I even discovered the headwaters of the Rio da Divia, River of Doubt, tracing it north to the Madeira and then to the Amazon. Eventually, they renamed the river the Rio Roosevelt.
However, I mean, it seems that the expedition was the death of you.
Well, not my death, but surely it took 10 years off my life. Seems I got a flesh wound in my leg that got infected, leading to tropical fever that resembled the malaria I got in Cuba when I was there with the Rough Riders. Plus, still having the bullet lodged in my chest didn't help, and I was riddled with chest pains, fever, and delirium.
Yeah, and after that, life was less fun for you.
Most definitely. For the rest of my life, I was plagued by flare-ups of malaria and leg inflammations, so severe that I required surgery.
And during your later years, World War I broke out.
Yes, I strongly supported the Allies and angrily denounced the foreign policy of President Wilson, who procrastinated entering the war. A war that would have ended long before it did had he not delayed. Why, it bothered me so much that I seriously thought about contesting the 1920 Republican nomination. However, my declining health prevented me from doing that.
On January 16th, 1919, you died in your sleep.
Yes, I died of a heart attack at my Sagamore Hill home at Oyster Bay, New York, and I'm buried at a nearby cemetery.
As you look back, any regrets?
In retrospect, the Brownsville incident in the summer of 1906 was probably the low point of my presidency.
What was that about?
Well, that summer, an all-black battalion of the 25th Infantry Regiment was transferred from Nebraska to Fort Brown near Brownsville, Texas. And though distinguished in battle and in the service to the United States, they were not welcomed by many of the white residents of that South Texas community, many of whom wrote letters to Washington asking for the removal of the soldiers.
Well, that's not really surprising. Even today, when we have a black president, many whites, especially in what were once the Confederate States, apparently still have issues with their fellow citizens who happen to be of African descent. Anyhow, so, what was the big deal?
In the early morning hours of August 14, 1906, a fight broke out and shots were fired. A local barkeep was killed and there was a seriously wounded police officer. Brownsville citizens quickly stepped forward and blamed the black soldiers, with some claiming to have actually seen the soldiers firing or hearing black voices during the skirmish. Because of this, 12 members of the 25th were imprisoned, and while 2 cursory investigations were held, no formal charges were presented. No trial was held, and none of the accused were able to confront their accusers.
Wow. How bogus is that?
Wait, it gets worse. Following the incident, the soldiers were assembled, and those who had participated in the so-called riot were ordered to stand forward. None did. They were then ordered to inform on those who participated in the riot, and none spoke. As a result, all the black soldiers, 167 of them, were brought up on charges of insubordination and recommended for dishonorable discharge.
And you did nothing?
Not Really, after the election of 1906 passed, I signed all 167 discharges, even though it was pretty evident from the beginning that the charges were dubious. And while most of the black America was outraged, they really lacked any power to reverse things and hadn't as of yet been a force in the voting booth.
Yeah, truly a disgrace and a blot on your record.
Yes, but that was a long time ago. Over the years, it became clear that the townspeople of Brownsville had framed the soldiers, and in 1972, President Nixon signed a bill correcting the records of the 25th Regiment to read honorably discharged. Still, I regret my action, though I do understand why I did it, and well, let's just leave it at that.
Fair enough. Why don't we talk about your legacy?
Yes, why don't we? Let's see. I was an enthusiastic proponent of the scouting movement and was given the honorary title of Chief Scout Citizen by the Boy Scouts of America, the only person to hold such a title. I was the first president to appoint a Jew to a cabinet position, Oscar Strauss, Secretary of Congress and Labor. And I appointed a number of Negroes to federal office as well. I'm one of the 4 presidents honored at the Mount Rushmore Memorial. I'm a holder of the Nobel Peace Prize and the Congressional Medal of Honor, which I am proud to say was also awarded to my eldest son, Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., for heroism at the Battle of Normandy in 1944. I've had 2 naval ships named for me, including an aircraft carrier that's been part of the Atlantic Fleet since 1986. My birthplace on East 20th Street in New York City and my Sagamore Hill home have been preserved and can be toured by the public. I've had a postage stamp issued in my honor and numerous streets and schools with my name on it, as well as hotels in Los Angeles and in New York. Plus, Robin Williams portrayed me in the movies, and I understand that the Washington Nationals have me as their mascot.
Wow, sure sounds like you have quite the legacy. Still, you didn't mention your most lasting popular legacy.
I didn't? Oh, are you talking about those damned bears? Evidently, on a hunting trip, a black bear was wounded, and I ordered it to be mercifully killed. A political cartoonist illustrated me with a bear, and a toy maker heard the story and asked me if he could use my name on a toy bear. I agreed, and thus was born the Teddy Bear, and, as it is said, the rest is history.
Well, we've just about run out of time, and I'd like to thank you, Colonel Roosevelt, for coming on the show. As is customary, do you have any parting comments for our audience?
Yes, Dan, I do. Never been known to pass up an opportunity to give a speech or two. First off, and in no particular order, I'm a hunter, a cowboy, and an American, which means I like my guns. Even became a life member of the National Rifle Association while president in 1907, paying a $25 fee. However, while I am an NRA card carrier and a supporter of our Second Amendment, I don't believe our founding fathers, 2 of whom I'm on Mount Rushmore with, ever envisioned that arms would evolve into the killing machines they've become. Plus, when the right to bear arms was crafted into the Constitution, we didn't have a standing military and the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and departments we have now. So as one gun lover to another, ease off on the arsenal, and let's keep in mind that the right to bear arms shouldn't be a right for crooks or kooks. Secondly, in an article I wrote in 1894 on immigration, I stated, "We must Americanize in every way, in speech, in political ideas, and in principles, and in the way of looking at relations between church and state." I went on to say that America welcomes the foreigner who becomes an American and has no use for the foreigner who remains a foreigner, that they must revere our flag. Not only must it come first, no flag should even come second. As I look at America today and how it regards immigration and immigrants, it seems we've lost our way. While I respect the heritage and culture of native countries, I also recognize that immigrants choose to come here, and as such, they need to adopt our culture, values, and language and adapt to our American way of life. What's this press 1 for English? On a related note, I, like George Washington, am not in favor of hyphenated Americans, as it seems to suggest one places their loyalty and affinity to a country or heritage other than America. Thirdly, while I was a Republican, I believed in government action to mitigate social evils, and I denounced what I referred to as the representatives of predatory wealth, as guilty of all forms of iniquity, from the oppression of wage workers to defrauding of the public. Fortunately, when I was president, I found an ally in an increasingly concerned public that was growing weary over the growing number and power of trusts or wealthy corporations. So I had their help, as well as the help of cooperative and compromising Congress in regulating offending corporations and not in busting or destroying them. As I look around today, I see offending corporations are flourishing, exercising undue power and influence on our government and placing their profit and greed above the common good. And I see that my old party, that once grand old party, has been bought and paid for, protecting the wealth and power of a few individuals and corporations rather than doing what's best for the American people. Lastly, the 1912 Progressive Party platform, which I was instrumental in crafting, referred to as an invisible government, an unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, whose destruction is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. 100 years later, that unholy alliance is alive and well, and what's worse is that millions of Americans believe this alliance to be holy. I went on to say that this country belongs to the people. Its resources, its businesses, its laws, its institutions should be utilized, maintained, or altered in whatever manner will best promote the general interest. Makes me angry that many of today's leaders, especially those calling themselves Republicans, appear not to give a damn about promoting the general interest. Perhaps they should be busted. Just saying.
Words of wisdom from our 26th president, who reminds us that in the 100 or so years that have transpired since he held office, that we really haven't evolved as much as a society as some of us would like to believe. So, until our next Chatting with History, this is Dan Gersten, reminding all of you that regardless of your political affiliation and regardless of your, socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, sexual preference, or even geography, that we're all Americans, and we should be seeking to promote the general interests over special ones. Thank you for watching.
Talk to me. Talk to me.